Now that we have more information in the David case, I want to address some of the theories, some of the rumors that have come out, and see if there's anything there. From was Celeste pregnant to was her body frozen? Did anyone else have a hand in allegedly murdering her? I want to get into this. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. So a lot has been said about the investigation, about the criminal case against David, 21-year-old singer David Anthony Burke, who is currently charged with first-degree murder, continuous sexual abuse of a child under 14, and unlawful mutilation of human remains, all in connection with the death of 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez. And we know that she was found dead, reportedly, in David's Tesla. And this was out in Los Angeles back on September 8th, that this happened at a tow yard. Now, I want to do something different. I want to address some of the theories, some of the speculation that has come up during the course of this investigation, and see, now that we have more information, see if we can figure out how true this is based on what we now know. So yes, we have more information, not all the information, but more information, and I want to get into it, address some of the theories about this. Because yes, prosecutors and the ME's office and law enforcement have come forward with more details about what they allegedly found. And this is after there being so much being closed off, so much being sealed. And so this is a good time to do this. And let's be clear, I have to imagine this is not all the evidence that they have, all the information that they have. We know that there's a preliminary hearing scheduled for the end of the month where prosecutors will present the bare minimum, sufficient amount of evidence to establish probable cause to support these charges. They don't have to present the entire case. They don't have to present everything that they're going to present at a trial, and particularly if an investigation's ongoing, but we do get a sense of where they're at. Okay, so the first one, was 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez pregnant at the time that she died? Now, the reason that this has come up is because in the prosecution's pre-trial brief, they go to the alleged text messages between David and Celeste. Quote, text exchanges between the victim and defendant contain references to sex, pregnancy, abortion, and use of the Plan B emergency contraceptive. There are also explicit photographs documenting and corroborating their sexual relationship. In November 2024, defendant and the victim broke up, although they continued to communicate, and text messages suggest they also continued to have sexual relations. And then just a few days ago, her death certificate was amended. It was amended to suggest that it was unclear if she was pregnant when she was killed. In other words, it was changed from not pregnant to unknown. Now, I spoke to forensic death investigator Joseph Scott Morgan about this on my News Nation show, Jesse Weber Live, and he said this could just be the medical examiner's office acknowledging the police investigation, acknowledging the findings of that investigation, the text messages, and since the state of her body, right, we're talking decomposed, dismembered, maybe they just have to put unknown. Even though, by the way, there's nothing in the actual coroner's report, right, the medical examiner's findings to indicate that she was pregnant. I mean, you go to that, here's what it says: uterus present and not enlarged, and without endometrial lesions and hemorrhage, ovaries and fallopian tubes appropriate for age, private area without lesions, breast tissue without lesions, other female reproductive tract findings, severe post-mortem changes noted. And again, I confirmed this with Joseph, and he said he looked through it, and he basically said there's nothing indicating in there that she was pregnant. And also, I have to say, if prosecutors believed that Celeste was pregnant, wouldn't they have included that in the filings? Remember, there's special circumstances allegations here. Prosecutors are not only claiming that David murdered Celeste, but he did it to keep her quiet, that he lied in wait, that he did it for financial gain. I mean, what better way to prove motive? What better way to prove he silenced a witness, killed her to protect his career than if she were pregnant? A 14-year-old pregnant with his child? That is strong proof of the sex charge that he faces. That's strong proof of the special circumstances allegations, right, for the alleged murder. But they don't mention that. They didn't mention that in the indictment. They didn't mention that in the brief. They didn't mention that at the press conference. Now, true, she was apparently in such a state of decomposition and dismemberment, it could get complicated. But again, at this point, nothing to say that she was pregnant. And I do believe if prosecutors had that piece of information, they probably would have gone forward with that. But let's see what happens. By the way, talking speculation, talking theories, speaking of that report, here's another theory. Did David and Celeste share tattoos? I gotta say, I feel like the answer is yes here, because TMZ initially reported, this was all the way back in September of 2025, how the singer has a tattoo on his finger, allegedly reading, shh. Now you go to the prosecution's brief. They write, in order to distance himself from the victim, he amputated her left ring and pinky fingers because her ring finger contained a tattoo of his name. Her fingers have not been recovered. You go to the medical examiner's report. Quote, the left ring and pinky fingers appear to have been mutilated, and I did not locate them during my scene examination. She has a tattoo that reads, shh, on the inside of her right index finger. And we learned that it was through that tattoo and dental records, that's how investigators were able to ID the body in the Tesla as that of Celeste. And just focusing upon her body for a minute, this came up during the course of the investigation. There was a theory out there, was Celeste's body frozen? What complicated this was the ME's office. Their findings were sealed by the court for all this time until recently. So a lot of this was guessing as to what happened. Now, we remember months ago, the LAPD Robbery Homicide Division released a statement addressing this, saying, quote, the Los Angeles Police Department is aware of the recent stories posted by various media outlets about the David Celeste Rivas investigation and would like to dispel some misinformation contained in their reporting. The body of Celeste Rivas was not frozen when it was discovered on September 8th, 2025. Now, to be clear, we don't know if at any point before that her body was frozen. However, there is nothing that has been presented by prosecutors, as far as I could see, to suggest her body was frozen. You go back to their filing, quote, moreover, defendant took horrifying measures to destroy and discard the victim's body. After placing her body into the blue inflatable pool to prevent her blood from spilling onto his garage floor, defendant used a chainsaw and perhaps other tools to cut off her limbs. Small blue plastic fragments were found embedded in the victim's remains, which were collected by the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's Department. The fragments were analyzed by the LAPD's Forensic Science Division Trace Analysis Unit. An expert was able to match a physical fit match from the blue fragments to the blue inflatable pool purchased by defendant in May 2025. In order to distance himself from the victim, he amputated her left ring and pinky fingers because her ring finger contained a tattoo of his name. Her fingers have not been recovered. Defendant then placed her head and torso into the cadaver bag he purchased. He placed her limbs into a garbage bag, which he deposited into his front trunk, laying the cadaver bag on top. For several weeks or possibly months, defendant left the victim's body to decompose inside his Tesla. He lied to friends, business associates, and others who noticed the strong smell of decay in and around his home and vehicle. Before leaving on his concert tour at the end of July, he parked his Tesla on the street around the corner from his home. LAPD served a search warrant of defendant's home at 1368 Tahini Place on September 1st, 2025, after the victim was identified by the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner on September 16th, 2025. Inside the garage, detectives discovered evidence consistent with the dismemberment of the victim's body in the inflatable pool, which contained multiple linear cuts. Several biological samples which tested positive for blood were collected within the garage area. DNA analysis determined that various samples matched the victim's unique genetic profile. On December 9th, 2025, the medical examiner ruled the victim's death a homicide caused by 2 penetrating injuries to the torso. On January 17, 2025, the victim's U.S. passport card was found by a Caltrans worker off SR 154 in Santa Barbara County. So again, this goes to the idea of they were very, very thorough and very, very specific in what happened to Celeste, what happened to her body, what they claim happened. But the idea that her body was frozen, nothing to suggest that at this point. Of course, there's going to be questions about where her body was at all times, but it seems at this point there was no physical evidence when the body was recovered to indicate it being frozen or thawing or anything like that. Okay, here's another one. Were others involved if these allegations are true? Now, this is something that we've all wondered about, we've all speculated about, particularly Steve Fisher, the private investigator who has been looking into this case from the very beginning. Remember, he represents the owner of the property where David had reportedly been staying, that was near where the Tesla was found. I mean, for a 20-year-old singer to murder and dismember and dispose of her body all by himself, some may say that is difficult to believe. It's difficult to process. But there is nothing in the statements from law enforcement, from prosecutors, nothing in the indictment, nothing in the brief filed by prosecutors that indicates there is someone else who conspired with or aided or abetted David in any of this. No one else is charged. I mean, Neil Langston, David's purported friend who was reportedly arrested for failing to appear as a witness in the grand jury proceedings, he's not been criminally charged directly in connection with Celeste's death. I keep going back to when I interviewed Nathan Hochman, the Los Angeles County DA, on my News Nation show, Jesse Weber Live, and asked him point blank about others being involved and others being potentially charged. And he said, we have an ongoing investigation. If anyone has information, come forward. And if and when we charge anyone else, you'll be the first to know. And by the way, I mentioned that point that David had allegedly lied to people about the smell, right? Well, TMZ published this video. It's reportedly from a July 4th, 2025 live stream, so a few months after the alleged murder. Oh, and according to the prosecution brief, this was only a few weeks later, July 29th, surveillance video and other evidence confirmed defendant was the last person to drive the vehicle on July 29th, 2025, before he left Los Angeles on a concert tour. Anyway, in this clip, David appears to be with Neil Langston and Sukana, and he apologizes for the way his bathroom smells, but blames it that he went to the bathroom a couple hours earlier. So is it possible, if these allegations are true and he's innocent until proven guilty, is it possible he kept it hidden from everyone? Maybe. Now, it's one thing to talk about the alleged murder and the alleged disposal of Celeste's body. It is another thing to talk about the alleged sexual abuse of Celeste. Remember that sex charge that he faces. And there are those who may find it difficult to believe that no one else knew about this purported illegal sexual relationship between him and Celeste, she being a minor. Again, if the allegations are true, like no one knew about this alleged relationship, then again, as reported by TMZ, those around the singer may have thought Celeste was 19 years old, that she was a student at USC. The problem is there apparently was a prior law enforcement investigation into this alleged illegal relationship back in 2024. It's possible it wasn't like David was allegedly hiding it. I mean, again, you go back to the brief by prosecutors, quote, despite being informed by law enforcement the victim was only 13, defendant continued to pursue her. After the victim returned home in February 2024, her parents took her cell phone away. Defendant drove to Lake Elsinore and paid a junior high school student in the victim's class $1,000 to give the victim a cell phone defendant purchased so they could stay in contact. Throughout 2024, the victim spent a significant amount of time with defendant, including summer weekends at his home in the Hollywood Hills and traveling with him to Las Vegas, London, and Texas to meet his family. So that goes to the idea there had to have been other people around if these allegations are true, right? What was he saying to people about Celeste if she was in fact around and if this is true? And you know what, Steve Fisher, he made an interesting point about this on X. He wrote, quote, minors such as Celeste Rivas Hernandez cannot just travel to London without consent. Here are the laws in the UK about minors traveling with an adult that is not their parents. U.S. citizens do need an ETA visa to travel to or through the UK. You'll need to show that your parent or guardian consents to your travel and accommodation arrangements. If you do have to apply for a standard visitor visa, you'll need to identify the adult traveling with you in your visa application. If the person you're traveling with is not your parent, you'll need to provide specific information about them in your application. You can identify up to 2 adults in your visa application. Their names will appear on your visa. The adult can apply for a visa at the same time, but you must each complete separate applications. Now, again, going to this idea of was anyone else involved or anyone else had knowledge, I have to address this. Talk about speculation, theories. There is another part that is out there about whether Celeste's family knew what was allegedly going on. There was an allegation that they were somehow paid off. We know the family has been relatively silent during this whole process. Again, understandably so. Think about what they've been going through. But as reported by TMZ, Celeste's father, Jesus Rivas, through the family attorney, Patrick Steinfeld, broke his silence. Quote, I never had any contact with this guy, and we haven't received any money from him or anyone in his family. Now, back on my show, Jesse Weber Live, I spoke to Lauren Conlon, columnist for Los Angeles Magazine, about these rumors, which apparently came from posts on Reddit originating from Celeste's hometown of Lake Elsinore. And she said, this family is going through something so horrific and so tragic that no family should have to go through. We're living in this crazy society where we blame the victim's family. And at this point, we just don't know enough. And I also interviewed retired detective law enforcement instructor Matt Irvine here on Sidebar. Here's what he had to say about it.
It would be absolutely normal and natural for a predator to ingratiate himself with the family of his victim. We don't know how or to what degree this happened in this case, but that puts blame on the predator and not on the family. David was a very powerful, glamorous, wealthy, successful artist. This is a family that by all accounts was struggling to get by in a kind of remote, distant, dusty corner of Southern California. The power dynamic there is overwhelming. The power over a child as young as 11 when this relationship started, and the power over a family of limited means trying to compete with this glamorous, successful, wealthy guy. Clearly, They took the phone away from her because there was something they objected to, something they were trying to keep from happening. He traveled 70 miles and gave $1,000 to a middle school kid to get her another phone. Whatever they tried to forbid, whether it was, judging, grounding, whatever they tried to do, the evidence is that Celeste responded by running away. And again, that's not casting any blame on Celeste either. She was a child, and her parents are victims in this too. And they've suffered a unspeakable loss at the hands, apparently, of somebody truly ghoulish. And we need to be careful as we talk about this that we don't start becoming ghouls ourselves. She is a victim, her parents are victims, and the only person to blame that we know of so far for the death of this child is David Burke.
And I'm glad you mentioned that. And just something else I'll add to this, couple things. One, it's impossible to know what this family is going through. I mean, it's one thing to have to go through this whole year of uncertainty, and then to find out the details of what happened to Celeste is unthinkable. Number two, and goes to the defense, if there was evidence that David was paying the family to keep them quiet about the relationship or anything like that, if they're trying to prove this sexual relationship, if they're trying to prove that he wanted to keep it quiet, I have to imagine that would have made its way into the evidence so far. I have to imagine that would have made its way into the brief. We haven't seen that. So I think that should be an important consideration for anyone out there who is casting some sort of blame or some sort of spotlight on the family. Just keep that in mind as we go into
Thank you for saying that. That's absolutely right.
I go now to another theory that came up. This is an interesting one. Was Celeste, again, assuming she was murdered, and allegedly, let's say she was murdered by David, was she killed in the house, like prosecutors seem to suggest? Quote, despite knowing she was dead and her family was trying to find her, the evidence will show defendant lied and claimed he didn't know where she was. In fact, defendant drove to Santa Barbara County immediately after the victim died, attempting to dispose of her property and destroy evidence. At approximately 11:30 p.m. on April 23, 2025, he drove away from his home as he texted and called the victim's phone asking where she was. Again, these were acts calculated and planned to set up his defense within a very short timeline after the victim's vicious murder. Defendant drove his Tesla north on the 101 freeway to San Marcos Pass Road, SR 154, near Lake Cachuma in Santa Barbara County. He returned home early the following morning on April 24, 2025, before going to a radio interview for the release of his album that week. He also sent 2 additional texts to the victim's phone that day, which obviously went unanswered because she was already dead. After April 26, 2025, defendant never attempted to contact her again. May 8th, 2025, defendant returned to the same area in Santa Barbara County, leaving his home around 11:30 p.m. He returned to the area again on May 31st, 2025. This is an isolated site off SR 154 where the victim's identification was subsequently discovered in January 2026. Additionally, on July 7th, 2025, defendant ordered and subsequently Amazon delivered a burn cage to his home under the same fake name as part of his plan to incinerate evidence. Defendant's cellular activity and communications derived from defendant's iPhone and Tesla, which demonstrate defendant's activities from April 22nd, 2025 to April 24th, 2025, including a trip to Santa Barbara County in the middle of the night after the victim arrived at his Hollywood Hills home. So, Steve Fisher talked about this, and particularly there was this idea that she arrives and then, again, allegedly killed, stabbed to death shortly after she arrives, and 10:30 p.m., David allegedly sends a text to Celeste's phone asking where she was. That's prosecutors alleging he was establishing an alibi, he was establishing a cover, like why would he send a text like that? But given the Santa Barbara trip, or the alleged Santa Barbara trip, and this digital evidence, this is what Steve Fisher posted. I thought it was an interesting theory. Quote, can't stop thinking about the timeline of the murder of Celeste Rivas Hernandez as put forward in the pretrial brief. Could the 10:30 p.m. "Where are you?" text messages actually be real and not a staged alibi? Could Celeste have walked away after an argument upon arriving in the Uber? Maybe those texts from David asking where she was were real, and after he didn't receive a response, he went looking for her, found her, and they ended up driving to Santa Barbara County where the killing actually occurred. He could have shut her phone off when finding her. In that scenario, her body could have remained along SR 154 for the roughly 12 days until the pool, body bag, laundry bags, and chainsaws were ordered and delivered, May 1st and May 5th. It is also worth noting that the pool was ordered after her death, meaning it would not have contained blood from the actual killing. The DA's version of events is a very compressed timeline: arrival at 10:10 p.m., a fatal stabbing, and then being composed enough to send an alibi text by 10:30 p.m. That is a 20-minute window. They also claimed the trip to Santa Barbara that evening was to start disposing of evidence. However, the evidence had not even been purchased yet. The pool, chainsaw, shovel, and other items had not even been ordered at the time of the first Santa Barbara trip. There's also the question of storing a body at his manager Josh Marshall's rental house for 12 days while waiting for tools, with nearby neighbors and decomposition odors likely becoming noticeable within a few days, all while David was out of town and having to trust that nobody would enter a house that wasn't even leased to him. None of this changes the central point that David is responsible. He killed Celeste, that I am certain of. Like I said, the DA is likely correct in their theory. They are working with all the evidence. Hashtag David, hashtag Celeste Rivas Hernandez. Now, I spoke with Steve last night on my News Nation show. Here's what he said about it.
Because we can't find this crime scene. And also, during the search warrant, we did not see the bio teams there. We didn't see the TEVEC suits. We didn't see a crime scene, established. To clean that up would be a mammoth.
And there was no evidence of, like, cleaning supplies bought or anything like that.
No, there wasn't. And we don't see luminol traces. We don't see crime scene markers. Definitely no bio evidence. We don't see them processing it as a bio evidence scene.
So yeah, the big thing for him is, like, on top of that timeline is there's not evidence of a cleanup in the house as far as he can see, as far as we know. So that would seem to suggest, was the killing actually committed there? Goes now to another question, another theory. Is David being framed? Well, first of all, he's pleaded not guilty. His attorneys deny the allegations. They say he didn't commit this murder. They say he's not the cause of Celeste's death. He is innocent until proven guilty. And I don't know if they plan to point the finger at somebody else. And, look, could there be openings for reasonable doubt? As far as we can tell, no surveillance footage in the house showing the alleged murder. No apparent eyewitness to the killing. Does raise a question of how prosecutors know certain things, like saying he stabbed her and watched her bleed out. How do they know that? Prosecutors say we know the day that he drove that Tesla, but did anyone else move it? But I will say, in terms of whether or not the theory he's framed, it is the combination of the evidence that may be tough for the defense. Why do I say that? Go back to the prosecution's brief. Quote, tellingly, defendant subsequently purchased tools to carry out his plot to dismember or dispose of the victim's body. On April 24, 2025, defendant ordered a shovel from Home Depot that was delivered to his home from Postmates. On May 1st, 2025, defendant ordered and subsequently Amazon delivered 2 chainsaws to his home. On May 3rd, 2025, defendant ordered and Amazon subsequently delivered a body bag, heavy-duty laundry bags, and a blue inflatable pool to his home. He made these purchases under the fake name Victoria Mendez. And I've heard this idea before, maybe while this was all for a music video, these purchases, but those particular items at that time, especially if the digital data will in fact show Celeste's movements to his house and the lack of cell phone activity from her after April 23rd, questionable. If they're able to track him to Santa Barbara, questionable. And the timing of this is key too, because remember, prosecutors allege he killed her by lying in wait to silence her as a witness, killed her for financial gain, keep her from coming forward with information about their alleged relationship to prevent her from ruining his career, and per the prosecutors in their brief, quote, April 23rd, 2025 is the likely date of the victim's death and when all her cellular activity ceased. The night prior, April 22nd, 2025, defendant and the victim engaged in a lengthy argument described in detail in their text messages. The messages revealed the victim's jealousy over defendant's relationships with other women, as defendant led her to believe they had a future together. She became extremely upset and threatened to disclose damaging information about her relationship with defendant to end his career and destroy his life. Defendant's first studio album was due to be released on April 25th, 2025. He had an emerging multi-million-dollar career already in progress. He also had multiple product endorsements which were highly profitable. And when it comes to evidence of the relationship, aside from the text messages that I mentioned, from the evidence list in the prosecution's brief, quote, the description of photographs depicting the victim naked, as well as while she was engaged with defendant in sexual activity when she was 13. As this evidence constitutes child sexual abuse material, the photographs themselves will not be presented. While all possible charges that could be proven were not filed, the CSAM is proof of their ongoing sexual relationship while the victim was 13 and 14 years old. And then it says, through March 2025, proved defendant continued to manipulate the victim as she messaged, all we do is have sex and just hang out. Man, I want more than that for myself. These messages were obtained from defendant's iCloud data. And then I just go to everything that I mentioned too, right? The digital data, the cell phones, the surveillance footage. And look, you can make the argument from a defense perspective. There's a lot of evidence here about the cleanup and the disposal and the dismemberment rather than the killing itself. So you can make the argument maybe this is just a circumstantial murder case. Maybe yes. And we'll see what the defense does, and we'll see what more the prosecution has. But in terms of the reliability, the accuracy of this data, the sufficiency of this evidence, again, here's Matt Irvine.
First of all, to your first question, I think the investigation that's been laid out so far has been thorough. It's been outstanding. The breadth and depth of investigation and evidence that's been hinted at so far by the LA District Attorney's Office is truly impressive. And I really have to hand it to LAPD and the DA's office for being willing to stand in silence and take the blows that they've been taking over these last 6 or 7 months, with all the folks saying, what are they doing or why aren't they doing anything? And it was very clear that they weren't able to talk about what they were doing, but they've clearly been doing a lot, and probably from the moment that Celeste's body was discovered in the Tesla.
This goes to a question: how can they track him, Matt? And how accurate is that data? Is this something that can be questioned by defense attorneys successfully at trial? Or in your experience, if you're talking about cell phone records, license plate readers, that becomes very, very difficult for defense attorneys to argue about the reliability, the accuracy of that data?
It's pretty hard to argue with geolocation data, especially if you've got multiple sources of data. It's quite likely, because this is not a sophisticated offender, that he didn't think about leaving his phone behind. And if he brought his phone with him, that can be tracked very precisely. Even when the phone is off, there is usually some limited geolocation data available with most smartphones. That's how your Find My Phone app works, even if your phone's turned off or the battery's died. As to the traffic cameras, that's a very good source of evidence. It would be interesting to see who manages those traffic cameras. Flock, which is the big company, typically only keeps that data for about 30 days, but they contract with different localities and law enforcement agencies, and so that can be extended. It would be unusual to me if that data was available 6 or so months later, which would be the earliest that an investigation could have started, because they didn't find poor Celeste until September. Traffic cameras are a possibility. I think more likely we're talking about geolocation data through the phone, and quite possibly through the Tesla as well.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. You can also check us out on NBC's Peacock as well. If you want to follow me, Instagram, my News Nation show, Jesse Weber Live, Monday through Friday, 11 p.m. Eastern. I'll see you next time, everybody.